Since President Xi became president in 2013, we have seen a move towards much less market-friendly policies, also in general, more totalitarian policies, more aggressive foreign policy stance and so forth that are clearly scared international investors in terms of economic policy and so forth. The demographic headwinds, combined with the fact that we need to bring down investment ratios to normal levels, implies that we will have a significant continued slowdown in Chinese growth.
Hello and welcome to the Achieving Alpha podcast. My name is Stephen and I am the host of the show. Today I'm delighted to be joined by Lars Christensen, who is an economist. He is also the associate professor at Copenhagen Business School, as well as a CEO and founder at Money and Markets Advisory. Pleasure to have you on the show, Lars. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you, Stephen.
Great. Excellent to have you. I just wanted you, if possible, to provide us a bit of a background into your experience as an economist and your career. That would be really great.
Yeah, nearly 30 years ago, I got my master's degree in economics. I have, as an economist, always worked as an economist, meaning I have been doing macroeconomic and finance for nearly 30 years now. First as a civil servant in the Ministry of Economic Affairs, and later as head of emerging market research at Danske Bank in Copenhagen for 15 years. And since 2015, I have been running my own advisory, markets and money advisory. On the side, I have had academic positions. I've been a research associate at Stellenbosch University. I'm presently associate professor at Copenhagen Business School. And in addition to markets and money advisory, I have also recently set up AI advisory called PACE. So I have also, through this period, taken a bit of a journey from macroeconomics to more and more micro-focused data. But data and analysis has been this common denominator all through my career.
Okay, excellent. Thanks for the introduction. Today, I thought we would focus on a number of different areas, but one of the areas which I thought was fascinating was to talk about China and some of the economic developments that have been happening in China. We all know for the last 1 or 2 years that the economy and the stock market has been struggling in China and in Hong Kong. And I thought it would be really good for us to talk about some of the factors in which you think why the Chinese economy is starting to struggle and why we're seeing a much slower growth story in China than we had done in previous decades.
Yeah, I can't say that I'm surprised. I actually authored a blog post nearly 10 years ago in August 2014 called China Might Never Be the Largest Economy in the World. And my hypothesis in that blog post was something that I moved closer to, I think, for 5 or 6 years at that time. So we're probably approaching 15 years for me as a China bear. And I would say I've become more bearish over time. The main theme in my 2014 piece was China is facing very significant demographic headwinds. At that time, we're already seeing the Chinese labor market start to shrink. And of course, that has continued. So we have had for more than a decade negative labor supply growth in China, and that is set to continue in the coming decades. And in that sense, China is following the path of Japan over the last 2-3 decades. So that has been at the core of that. Another thing that I highlighted back then is that China have had very high investment ratios. Obviously, normally we consider that to be a positive. High investment, that can't be bad. But it is bad because it partly reflects misinvestment, malinvestment. China has had investment ratios, a share of GDP of close to 40% essentially for 30 years. Other economies of a similar income level have probably investment ratios of 1/3 of that. So what we have is some indication that it's not only that growth perspective might be good, it is also because we have seen heavy government substitute or subsidies going into investment. Particularly, we have seen the real estate market booming for 30 years. We have mentioned massive investment in housing. Obviously, a lot of that is completely natural. a result of urbanization, opening up of the Chinese economy, investment coming in. All of that is there's no problem with that. All of that has been driving growth in the real way. But what we have seen is because China has failed to develop its financial markets, failed to open up its economy for its own citizens to invest abroad, failed to develop pension systems and so forth, most Chinese people are putting their savings into BRICS. And it has been subsidized by essentially government intervention in the banking sector and loans and credits to households. And every time we have had a slowdown in the Chinese economy, the Chinese government and the People's Bank of China has done everything to get investment going again. So we have seen significant overinvestment, in my view. That was another point I made 10 years ago, that 40% investment ratio would sooner or later have to decline. And we would sooner or later have to allow essentially the Chinese to have more consumption growth and less investment growth. That would be healthy growth. And some part of what we're seeing is a healthy transition from this very investment-led economy to a consumption-led economy. The third fact I highlighted was the lack of fundamental economic reform. China had reforms that started back in the 80s, accelerated in the 90s and in the early 2000s, market-driven reforms, opening up the economy, free market reforms. However, since President Xi became president in 2013, we have seen a move towards much less market-friendly policies, also in general, more totalitarian policies, more aggressive foreign policy stance and so forth that are clearly scared international investors. So what we're seeing, the third factor is what we call total factor productivity, essentially the catching up factor in the economy. So when you come from a very low level of income, you can catch up by introducing foreign technologies, know-how from abroad and so forth. But if you start to close down the economy again, those factors will go into reverse. And I think we're seeing that in China. So I highlighted these three factors 10 years ago. And overall, I must say that we have moved in that direction, but it's just become worse. It has become worse in that sense that on the policy side, things have become worse and worse. And so if you look forward, even if we say that the situation does not evolve in a more negative direction geopolitically, in terms of economic policy and so forth, the demographic headwinds, combined with the fact that we need to bring down investment ratios to normal levels, implies that we will have a significant continued slowdown in Chinese growth. And I don't think it's unreasonable to think within the next decade to 15 years, Chinese trend growth in terms of real GDP will probably drop to close to zero, even below, as we have seen in China over the past 3 decades.
Okay. All right. And what we've seen as well is we've seen that over the last year or two, we've also seen the Chinese government put in a lot of different things in order to try and stimulate the economy and to try to bring back some level of growth. We've seen them reduce the RRP reverse repo percentages, and we've also seen small and medium enterprise businesses being given some stimulus to borrow money, etc. Do you think that they will continue down this road? And do you think they have any other things in the armory to be able to stimulate the economy?
I think what is telling about what the Chinese have been doing over the last couple of years, essentially since 2008, has been to spur growth through demand side measures. First, back in 2008, massive fiscal stimulus and credit policies of different kinds. But there's very little happening on the supply side of the economy. And I think it comes to the fact that the Chinese Communist Party is as a crossroads. It has to decide whether to let go of power, just to some extent, allow more openness, or to maintain a relatively totalitarian, closed political system. The problem is that if you want to allow more economic freedom, you also allow for more flow of information. And in that scenario, you have to loosen your grip on power politically. And we've seen the opposite. So there is lack of supply side reform. And with the lack of supply side reform, this slowing of trend growth continues. Because it's not a given that trend growth should continue to slow. China could do a lot to open up the economy further, could do a lot to privatize, could do a lot to liberalize the economy. both politically and economically, that could spur growth significantly to offset the negative impact of negative demographics and the slowing down of investment growth. It could do a lot in that direction, but there is this, from the perspective of the Chinese Communist Party, they're between a rock and a hard place. They want to spur growth, but they don't want to liberalize. And so what they do instead is come up with all these measures to ease fiscal policy and credit policy. And notice I'm saying credit policy rather than monetary policy. Because another thing is that if you want to ease monetary policy, which you could argue is necessary with an economy on the brink of deflation, if you wanted to ease monetary policy, you need to allow your currency to weaken. And allowing the yuan to weaken would send a negative political signal, or at least that's a perception among Chinese policymakers, both around the Communist Party and in the People's Bank of China, is that a weaker currency is telling the Chinese people that something is fundamentally wrong with the economy. And you can argue that is the case, that there is something fundamentally wrong. There is a slowdown in trend growth. In many ways, a natural slowdown in trend growth after 30 years of very high economic growth and nearly unseen economic historically. So there is a natural slowdown in growth, but there is a hard time. It's hard to acknowledge this because the CCP's claim to fame is that after the disasters of the Mao years, the Communist Party has reinvented itself as this growth engine. And this, if you notice what the Chinese Communist Party is saying all the time about eradication of poverty and equality, and a lot of the trust among the Chinese populace for the Chinese Communist Party is about delivering on economic growth. And if the Chinese Communist Party do not deliver on economic growth, it might lose power. And it can only deliver on growth if it undertakes economic reforms, and undertaking economic reforms means liberalizing, and then it might end up losing growth. So it's, from the perspective of the CCP, stuck between a rock and a hard place. I think that's where we are. There has recently been a lot of discussion about whether we would see a devaluation of the yuan. My perspective on this is that either we get some depreciation within moving towards a more flexible exchange rate regime, or we continue to down the deflationary path. The point is that if you have a slowing trend growth, you will also see your currency depreciate in real terms. And if you don't allow your currency to depreciate in nominal terms, then you will have to have lower inflation than the economy that you're pegging. And China is mostly just pegging the dollar. And we have 2% inflation in the US, then you need to have lower than 2% inflation in China, more or less, if you want to peg your currency. So that creates this deflationary impulse. And so that's what Japan was for 30 years. You had a tendency for the currency to depreciate in real terms, but you conducted monetary policy to avoid that depreciation, should that depreciation happen through a weakening or through deflation. And we can see that's where China is. We have seen within the last year, actually deflationary inflation numbers or CPI numbers in China. I don't think that we are as deep in deflation in China as we have been in Japan over the past 30 years. We are not there yet. I think actually relatively far from that. But you have those tendencies. And with the fear of, on the one hand, allowing the currency to weaken, you're probably going to accept those at least disinflationary tendencies. And from a debt perspective, that's quite dangerous. If you have an unhealthy property market, if you have debt problems, those debt problems and those problems in your property market gets worse when you move towards deflation. So again, something needs to happen. And that's why they are playing around with reserve requirements in the banking sector. That's why they are doing all kind of fiscal style credit policies where they're trying to support the banking sector, but without easing monetary policy. But we've seen it again and again that if you have underlying deflationary tendencies, you can't do it with credit policy. You can't do it by playing around with the banking sector. What you need to do is to ease monetary policy. But again, politically that seems very hard to move in that direction. But I think gradually we will move towards probably a widening of the de facto fluctuation band of the yuan against the dollar, a more freely floating currency. I don't foresee a major, let's say, a 20% devaluation. I don't see that. I've seen there's been quite a lot of speculation about that. I have worked as a policy advisor to governments around the world, also governments that you would say are as totalitarian as the Chinese or have authoritarian tendencies. And in those countries, nobody knows about what economic policy direction you have, other than the key policymakers at the very top of the system. So I think that when somebody has a very clear view on China will do this, no, only a handful of people in China know what China will do in terms of such a major decision as, for example, undertaking a large devaluation. So nobody knows. There can be signs. Economic gravity tells us that they need to move in that direction. But Japan had deflation for more than 2 decades, and it has only been recently that Japan has undertaken policy steps to do something about that. So I'm not saying that China will have deflation for 2 decades. I actually don't think that the system can withstand that. But I think you can maintain the status quo for longer than often perceived.
I wanted to ask you as well, Lars. So the Chinese government target, I think, is about 5% growth for the year. Do you think that they will try to do all they can to achieve that growth for the perception inside of the country that it's still growing, and for to try and calm people in China that things aren't quite as bad as they might seem on the outside?
Yeah, that's clearly what we've seen in recent years, that unrealistic growth targets. You can also say it's somewhat odd you have a growth target. You can have an inflation target, but you can't have a growth target. Then you need to undertake structural reform to have a longer term growth target. Year-on-year growth targets smells of planned economy, and that's still a legacy of communist economic thinking. I think there is a paradox actually here, reflected in that Chinese economic thinking in many ways is still communist. You move towards market determined prices, a free market economy in many sectors of the economy. But the fundamental idea of where growth comes from is fundamentally Marxist. It's the idea that capital accumulation is what drives growth. Industrialization is what drives growth, rather than ideas and innovation. So you can contrast that with a Schumpeter view of the world, of creative destruction, of free markets, essentially Anglo-Saxon American idea that growth flows not from capital accumulation, but from new ideas and innovation. But new ideas and innovation is in contrast to totalitarian regime. And I think so China can't embrace the ideas view of growth and instead continue to be in this Marxist thinking. You would call it market Marxist thinking, that we allow for free markets to determine prices in certain sectors, but we still overall have a very strong grip on where the economy is going. We maintain a target on real GDP growth, and we control credit allocation very strongly, and we are very focused on the investment side of the economy. And so that you're seeing, and every time they try to spur growth, that's what they try to do. They think more capital accumulation, more investment. And so that's one thing. The other thing is that if you look at it over the past decade or more, Chinese economic data has become increasingly unreliable. I think there is an increasing divergence between what we see in GDP growth numbers, official GDP growth numbers, and what we, for example, you're sitting in Korea. One of the good measures of this is Korean exports to China, because the Korean statistics office do not falsify the numbers. Those are the best numbers you can get. And so Korean export numbers to China normally is a fairly good indicator of Chinese economic trends. And if you look at those numbers, and if you, for example, look at car sales, if you look at energy consumption, goods transports, and so forth, there are indications that over the past decade to 15 years, increasingly GDP numbers have been disconnected from reality. And I'm not saying that everything is completely wrong. This is not North Korea, but increasingly there is a divergence. So if the Chinese government wants to have 5% growth, it can have 5% growth, and it will likely get it, at least in the official data.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, because it's all very well just having the numbers, but you have to obviously believe the numbers that go behind it.
Yeah, and I'm a big believer in data, and I'm a big believer in high frequency data. So I always, and of course, I've been working with emerging markets for the more than 2 decades. And it is not so that all emerging market governments are cheating on the numbers, but the quality of the numbers for all kinds of reasons might not be good. And so if you're following emerging markets, what you always want to track is private sector numbers as well. For example, car sales, energy consumption, export from other countries to the country you follow, and so forth. And that gives you a better view. And until, let's say, 2008, 10, I do think that the Chinese GDP numbers actually were fairly close to being right as they could be in an emerging or economy as the Chinese. Even though probably in the mid 2000s, the GDP numbers was too low relative to reality. But that's not the case anymore.
Do you think some of the issues with the slowdown in China and the economy, do you think some of it is to do with the increasing competition in terms of manufacturing from other countries? And maybe some of they're losing some of their business to Vietnam or other economies which are traditionally now doing a lot of the manufacturing. And do you think obviously COVID was a big factor as well, or do you think it's part of a that's more short-sighted thing?
Yeah, no, the competition story is right, but it's also not bad in the sense that if your economy develops and you get a higher income levels and salaries growth, and therefore you might become less competitive in low skilled manufacturing sectors. That's not a bad thing. That's a reflection that your economy is developing. So that's very much what we have been seeing in, let's say, Poland or the Baltic states, that their economies have become less competitive because we have seen income catch up. You're moving into new phases where service industry becomes more important, and so you could become less competitive in manufacturing, and you develop your economy, have a more skill-based economy, and that's very much what across Central and Eastern Europe. And some of that is certainly also what we've seen in China. So I have I don't think that it's necessarily bad that the economy is slowing down. A lot of that is a natural consequence of the economy becoming more wealthy. We have to remember that uh, the 1960s and the 1970s were terrible years for the Chinese economy, for the Chinese nation. Mass starvation, millions of people died in starvation in China in that period. So China came from an extremely low level of income, from a poverty-stricken economy. And in that scenario, 30 or 40% GDP growth a year is not miraculous. You just stop beating the economy down, then that happens. And then you go to from 30 to 15 to 10% growth to 5% growth. And you're still in a world that you say, this is a miracle. It's not a miracle, it's because it was expected in the sense what you undertake in terms of reforms, but that's a natural consequence. And there was nothing bad about the fact that growth was slowing as long as income levels were becoming higher. What we're now seeing, however, is that the policies on their own is having a negative impact. One of the reasons China has negative demographics is politics, is the one-child policy. It's not only the one-child policy, but that's part of the story. And it's aggressive geopolitical stance. It's a much less market-friendly environment. These things are things that have developed over past decade. I've significant, even though you can say that what I wrote a decade ago was very much driven by my perception about what would happen in terms of investment, what would happen in terms of demographics. I was negative in that sense, that the slowdown would continue. But over that decade, where I really changed my mind is not on these issues. I still believe those issues, but is where China has moved in terms of economic policy and in terms of geopolitics. That President Xi is not as his predecessors. And I think that's really the key point here to me, that economic policy and general policy in China has changed over the past decade.
Yeah, because I think those sort of growth numbers that they had historically over the years were not sustainable to keep up over the long term. So, for example, I was in China. I was living in China around 2011, something like that, and that was a period of a lot of growth, right? And everyone was buying properties and all sorts of stuff because it was like it was going to go on forever.
Yeah, no, there in exactly that period where you were in China, there was a very significant easing of monetary and fiscal policy as a response to the global financial crisis in 2008. And Chinese policymakers was completely focused on, we do not want to have the kind of shock that they have in Europe and the kind of shock that you have in the US. And in many ways, that policy reaction, in my view, was correct. But we could also see that it was far too aggressive. And the way it was done probably contributed a lot to that misinvestment or malinvestment in terms of property investment and very easy money that created these misallocations and yeah, I would say easy credit policy as well. So exactly that period was very special because everything that came before that in terms of growth, I think, was fundamentally and structurally very sound. It reflected the opening of the Chinese economy and the liberalization, the urbanization, foreign investment coming in. So the 30 years prior to that, from let's say in the mid 80s, and particularly after 2000, where we had China join the World Trade Organization and foreign growth coming in, a lot of that was the real deal. I certainly think so. So it's not that we have 30 years of misallocation, 30 years of doing everything wrong. No, we had, let's say, 25 years of doing a lot of things right in terms of opening up the economy. But once the natural headwinds started, that the slowdown, the catching up process was beginning to slow, that the impact of the misallocation of capital into the housing market would have an impact, and the demographics started to kick in. Instead of re-energizing the Chinese economy through reforms, we have seen all kind of quasi-Marxist attempts to spur demand growth through credit policies, through fiscal measures, and then a lot of playing around with the economy in terms of intervention, and of course all this the political side of things. And then that really adds to the negative growth effects.
And you mentioned earlier in our discussion the parallels between the Japanese economy when they had the boom and bust cycle. What was it, in the late 80s, I think it was? And then obviously what was happening in China in the early 2000s, in the 1990s and early 2000s with the growth. What is some of the similarities between both of them and also the differences between those two cycles and what it meant for the global economy?
I think that was something that is notable in terms of Japan is that Japan essentially never went through political crisis all through this period. We had what you can say about Japan in that period is actually after the Second World War, the Liberal Democratic Party, the LPD, became the completely dominant force in Japanese policy, essentially being in power since the end of the World War and until and you could question the level of democracy to some extent in Japan, and certainly if you look at the 60s or 70s in Japan, it wasn't a perfect European or North American democracy, but it mostly was. But with economic crisis and slow growth and negative demographics and deflation and banking crisis and all that, Japan has not become less democratic, it has become more democratic. It has become more pluralistic. The LPD is still a very dominant force in Japanese society and Japanese policy, but it's much more plural society now than it was 40 years ago. And so Japan has, in that sense, managed the crisis. We haven't seen massive social unrest. And the reason is, of course, that on a GDP per capita basis, Japan is extremely wealthy. And if you look at GDP per capita growth, in the past 30 years, Japan has performed relatively well. In fact, pretty much as an average Western European country. It isn't a lack of growth in GDP per capita terms, but it's absolute GDP. And I think that's a difference, because what we're seeing in China is both. It's both lower growth in GDP per capita, but also total GDP. So, and it comes at a time where Chinese, or as I said Japan, I meant China has significantly lower GDP per capita than Japan have had. So I think that in itself is also a challenge. So sometimes it says that China is becoming old before it's becoming wealthy. And so I think that's a real significant political challenge. And I think a lot of observers 15, 20 years ago had the idea that with, I wrote a book on the US economist Milton Friedman. Milton Friedman used to say that economic freedom and political freedom can't exist without each other. That economic freedom is necessitated by political freedom, and the other way around. Towards his death in 2006, Milton Friedman reflected on this and said his greatest mistake probably was to say this, that he thought that China had been able to create economic freedom without political freedom. And therefore China had been able to create growth without political freedom. And I think if you look at it now, the paradox is that Milton Friedman is now being proven right, not of his view in the mid 2000s, but of his original view that you can't have the one without the other, that you need to have a free flow of information and diverse views in the economy to develop ideas that is at the core of having growth and innovation. And China is now struggling with allowing that. The Communist Party of China will not let go of its power. And so it can continue to have growth.
And that's a good segue actually into talking more about the demographics in China. I know that they have an extremely aging population, and they previously had those policies in place, the one-child policy, and now they have uplifted that to you're allowed several children. How do you see the demographics playing out long term? Do you think they're going to continue to have this aging population, or do you think the lifting of the Chinese one policy might improve things over time?
I think it will have an impact. But even though I think the child policies was a grave policy mistake, it's a totalitarian policy measure in all ways, and evil measure had significant negative ramifications. You can just see the development of in how many fewer girls are being born than boys and so forth. So all of these draconian policy, in my view. That being said, if we compare China to Taiwan, where no such policy has been in place, Taiwan is facing nearly as bad demographic outlook as China. The difference is that Taiwan continues to develop economically and is a stable, free market, democratic economy. So Taiwan is an economy and a society that will manage this well, in my view. China is not. And if you look at the UN is doing population projections, and they're as good as anybody else. It says over the next century, the population of China might nearly be halved in size. Obviously, a very negative demographic outlook for China. And obviously, with that follows all kinds of geopolitical implications. And I think some of China's more aggressive geopolitical stance reflects this. As by the way, I think the negative outlook of demographic outlook in Russia reflects is reflected in Vladimir Putin's horrendous geopolitical adventures. And so I think there's come something to that. But that being said, these things can change. And it might be that demographics becomes a less important factor going forward. There might be other factors that might spur economic growth. I'm a lot focused on what AI can do in terms of spurring economic growth. And I think it's a tremendously positive factor in terms of growth. But the fact is that demographic is a very slow moving factor. And interesting enough, demographic forecasts actually tend to be relatively good because we know how many children are born today. So we have a pretty good idea how many people will enter the Chinese labor market in 15 years, 20 years, because these people have already been born. And without making too wild assumption about expected lifetime and retirement ages, you can make pretty good predictions for the next decade, for the next 2-3 decades on labor supply growth. And all of those, no matter how you look at this, the demographic situation is bleak for China.
Yeah. And I think you can make some gains in terms of productivity, as you said, through things like AI. But I guess where would be more of a concern would probably be areas of kind of blue collar workers, right? The manufacturing and production where you actually need physically people to produce things.
Yeah, and you can say in terms of AI, I think that what is interesting is that AI will actually, in terms of productivity growth, benefit high-income countries more than low-income countries, because AI will introduce automatization within white-collar jobs, traditional, relatively high and middle income jobs, and where you can have significant productivity gains. Banking sector, health, also in retail. There you're going to see the tremendous, I think in finance, for example, I think we're going to see massive productivity gains in the next very short period. Within the next 5 years, I think we're going to see very substantial productivity gains in health. Also in health, but in finance. So health and finance are the most obvious, but also in retail. And if you look at China, China has some of that, but China is a manufacturing economy, and there you're not going to see the same benefits from automatization because labor is cheap or relatively cheap, and that automatization has already happened. And so what we're likely to see is a rather interesting pattern is that high income countries will benefit more from AI than low income countries. And that, in terms of the story we have been used to talking about for the past 30 years, then that is changing.
If we have a big hole in the global growth, because if China starts to slow down the amount of growth, what countries can you see that growth being made up for the overall global growth picture? So which other countries can contribute to that to fill the void?
If I shut down US politicians, if I stop listening to Joe Biden and Donald Trump, and that's hard to do, I try to do that, then there is no doubt in my mind that it's very hard to be pessimistic on US growth. I am, in fact, tremendously optimistic on US growth. And would like to highlight 3 factors. As we talked about AI, I think AI will bring tremendous benefits that will be significantly larger than what we have seen in terms of internet and mobile phones over the past 2-3 decades. I think it will be a tremendous change in productivity in many sectors. I highlighted already finance, health, retail, where we're going to see these tremendous productivity gains in a relatively short time span. The other thing I would like to highlight is actually the obesity problem in the US, that clearly since the 80s increasingly become a health problem in the US. Now nearly half of the US adult population, with 40 to 50% of the US population being obese, that is not only a health problem, that is also a significant economic problem. It's a burden on the healthcare sector. which comes with a lot of cost. That's one thing, but it also has significant labor market cost. We know that particularly obese women have much lower incomes than normal weight women. Also, when you correct the numbers for education, for experience, for age. So even if you do that, obesity on its own is a major drag on income and employment situation. If you look at across studies, there's been a lot of time studying this. If you look across studies, both in Europe and in the US, obesity probably reduces the average income of women by 10%. So obese women have 10% lower income than normal weight women with similar education experience and age. So as a thought experiment, imagine that we could cut obesity in half in the US and say that 10% discount on obese women's salaries would disappear for those who got rid of the problem. What would that imply? That would imply 2 percentage point higher GDP in the US. That alone, not even taking into account productivity gains, effects on the healthcare cost, and so forth. If you look at the healthcare cost, and an average obese Dane, if you look at, for example, the studies done in Denmark, the healthcare cost of obese is around double of what the healthcare cost of normal weight Danes are. That implies for Danish numbers that if we had no obese, in Denmark we have about 20% of the population being obese. If there was no obese Danes, healthcare costs, everything, equal, would be around 10% lower, or what account for 1% of GDP. Again, tremendous impacts if we could do something about obesity, and we can now do that. And of course, as a Dane, I should highlight that because Novo Nordisk, who producing Wegovy and Ozempic, the anti-obesity medicine, is Danish and is having a tremendously positive effect on the Danish economy, I should say. But it's also having a tremendously positive effect, I believe, on the global economy, and particularly in the US economy, where the obesity problem is the largest. So if you take AI and anti-obesity medicine, those two things will contribute to US growth in a very significant and meaningful way going forward. Furthermore, and the third factor I would mention is, and in the US, they're talking about the refugee crisis, immigration crisis at the border. Sorry. And it's not a crisis. It's something very different. It is what it was in the 90s. And if you compare it to the 90s in the US, you had a period of significant technological development. The internet had a real significant impact on US growth, but so did immigration. And if you look at those three factors combined, strong immigration numbers. And where I would argue that immigration to the US is driven by the fact that people go to the US to look to improve their life. They're coming there to help themselves. And they do that by working, by innovating, by educating themselves. Unlike some of what we're seeing in what we could call welfare immigration in Europe, where it's the attraction of welfare system that attracts immigrants to a large extent, particularly from outside of Europe. So you have those three factors: immigration, anti-obesity medicine, and AI. If I combine that, I think bring us back to 1990's productivity growth rates, probably for the next decade. And if I see it like that, then it's hard to be really negative about the US, even with the polarized society you have in the US, even with the politics. And I should, of course, mention the public finances that are in a terrible state in the US. But overall, you can argue, by the way, that the US started to do something about public finances in the 90s. It slipped again later. But in the 90s, during the Bill Clinton years, there was a real step towards two parties and support for bringing down the budget deficit. So we could hope that comes back.
Yeah, and I saw on your blog post, I saw a study that you made around some simulations around the effect of AI on the economies, but also on the central bank's response to those. From your simulations, what type of productivity gains can you see? And how do you think central banks might react to those productivity gains?
Yeah. So what I was interested in studying is what is the impact of AI on inflation and on monetary policy. And normally you would say that if you have something that boosts productivity, that will lower inflationary pressures. And obviously that effect is there, and that is probably relatively substantial. And you would see that, for example, in healthcare costs, that you should expect healthcare costs to start to decline in the US as a result of this, and the same in the banking sector. That, and maybe also in retail, that AI, machine learning, so forth, will be disinflationary impulse to the economy. However, there is one thing we need to take into account as well, and that is that when trend growth, real GDP growth in trend terms goes up, so goes the natural interest rate. The interest rates that you have when the economy is in balance, when the inflation is not accelerating and it's not deceleration, that inflation is stable, the growth is stable. The interest rate level you have there, sometimes called the natural interest rate. When trend growth increases, the natural interest rate should go up as well. And so what I set out to study in my blog post and in the simulations I did was to say, what if we have a positive productivity growth? And what if that increases the natural interest rate? But the central bank, the Federal Reserve, is slow to recognize that has happened. And it might be slow to recognize that because the disinflationary tendencies actually keeps inflation down. In that situation, the central bank might keep interest rates lower than the natural interest rates. So when the natural interest rates increases and you keep your actual interest rates unchanged, the policy rate unchanged, that is essentially an inflationary stimulus that will stimulate demand in the economy. And so what my simulations are indicating is that the AI revolution might have a one-off or will have a deflationary tendency, but that will be more or less offset fully by the Federal Reserve having too easy monetary policy if it fails to recognize, at least for a period, that the natural interest rates have gone up. So you will have strong demand growth, but you might not have inflation throwing up because it will turn into real GDP growth for a period. And that, in my view, is some of what we saw in the late 90s, that we didn't see inflation showing up, even though monetary policy likely was too easy, because you had an impact, deflationary impact of technological innovation. So they were more or less upsetting each other, but that then you got too easy monetary policy, but it didn't show up in inflation. It showed up in asset bubbles and misallocation. We of course saw with the booming stock markets of the late 90s. A lot of that was, by the way, I would say argue was right, because underlying the economy was moving in to a much higher growth rate than prior to the 90s. But some of it towards the end of the 90s certainly became bubble-like. And my simulations is indicating that is what we should be focusing on to some extent, that in conduct of monetary policy, the Federal Reserve likely should not look at inflation, likely more should look at demand growth. And I have for many years argued that the Federal, rather than targeting inflation, should target nominal GDP growth. If the Fed instead focused on nominal GDP growth, let's say 4% nominal GDP growth, then it would avoid getting too easy monetary policy if there is a positive supply shock. Or on the other hand, let's say there is a negative demographic shock, that I'm wrong about AI, that I'm wrong about anti-obesity medicine, I'm wrong about demographics or immigration, but that we are in a deglobalization, we are moving towards protectionism, and we're going to have lower trend growth. Then you would see a situation where that would be inflationary as a one-off impulse, and the Fed might move too aggressively to combat that by tightening monetary policy. So they would fail on the other direction. The only way to avoid failing on monetary policy when there is supply side uncertainty is to focus on nominal demand, focus on nominal GDP growth rather than headline inflation numbers. And the Fed has never spelled this out as a policy, but if you look at nominal GDP growth in the US from, let's say, 2010 until 2020, it was smack on a 4% growth path. And what I argue is that the Fed should actually turn that into their actual target. And they should, by the way, be less focused on controlling monetary policy with interest rates, because they would then need to know what is the natural interest, and rather to use the money base to control the stance of monetary policy. I think we're some way away from that. But the Fed have learned the lesson both from the 90s and from 2008 and from 2020. But we also know the Fed often makes mistakes again and again. And so at the moment, I'm not overly concerned that the Fed will make a major policy mistake in either direction. But 1-2 years ahead, if growth continues to be robust and productivity driven, and we, let's say, have nominal GDP growth of 6% while we still have 2% inflation, and the Fed says, oh, there's no problem, we have 2% inflation. In that scenario, the risk of bubbles increases and misallocation and so forth. And in that scenario, we might go to a more boom bust like scenario. And I would certainly be concerned about that. I'm not there yet, but my simulations indicate we should keep an eye on it going forward.
Yeah. Okay, that's excellent. And I can add a link to your blog post so everybody can read a little bit more about it. Yeah, in terms of the Fed, they've obviously got a number of different mandates, right? And one of them is to keep unemployment as low as possible. I read somewhere that the OECD estimates were that 27% of jobs might be displaced by AI opportunities that come up in the market. Do you think that could have an effect on unemployment, or do you think it's just going to cause more productivity and create newer type of jobs than we've seen in the past? What's your view on employment from AI?
I think, as most economists, zero fear of productivity-driven unemployment. It has never happened. There is not one example in economic history of economic-wide unemployment having been caused by productivity gains. It has never happened. And I would also argue it will never happen. And I have a newspaper article I share in some of my presentations. I do a presentation on AI and the future of the global economy. And in that, I have a number of newspaper articles going back in time. And there is one from the New York Times in 1928, so nearly 100 years ago, where the headline is, "You will lose your job because of machines," or something like that. And I think that's very telling. And we see this through history, that certain sectors, people will lose their jobs, but overall employment levels will not. Unemployment level.
It's like Henry Ford, right, where they said, "Who would want to drive cars when you can ride a horse?"
Yeah, exactly. And I don't know what I will be doing in the future, what my children will be doing. And I certainly do not know how the economy of our grandchildren would look. That's, by the way, a title of a John Maynard Keynes essay written about 100 years ago. John Maynard Keynes, of course, a famous British economist, 100 years ago said that we give a description about how would the British economy develop over the next coming 100 years. And when you read that essay, John Maynard Keynes, when he wrote a beautiful prose, and it's a very insightful and thoughtful essay. And he was right about a lot of things about the general economic well-being of Brits, how that would develop over the next 100 years. Of course, he didn't know about what will follow in that 100 years: the Second World War and the Cold War and the internet and all kinds of transitions and major changes. But in terms of the economic development, he got it pretty right. What he didn't get right was how much time we spend on working. And John Maynard Keynes' prediction 100 years ago was an average Brit would work 15 hours. And that has certainly not turned out to be true. Brits and most Europeans, and particularly most Americans, work a lot more than that. And why? So the interesting thing is, as we get wealthier, why do we choose to, every time we earn $1 more, a euro more, whatever, why don't we split that between half of it on more consumption and half of it on more leisure, buying leisure time? We don't do that. We tend to buy a lot more consumption than half of it, and much less than half of it of extra leisure time. We do buy more and more leisure time over time. And obviously, with AI, more people might be attracted to the fact that they're becoming more wealthy and just deciding, I don't need to work 60 hours a week or 50 hours a week or 40 hours a week or 30 hours a week. The more people might decide that. But that to me would be a result of us becoming more wealthy. It's certainly not a disaster if that happens. But I don't think that in itself it would create a lot of unemployment. Certainly no major wave of what we'll call involuntary unemployment, that people that wanted to work to market wages, going market wages, would not be able to find a job.
Yeah, I saw an interview, I think it was last week actually, with Elon Musk. And Elon Musk was talking about AI. And he mentioned that long into the future, that working might be optional. It might be optional whether we work. And it goes in with what you're saying about people maybe wanting more leisure time than work time if you have increased productivity.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. Elon Musk says that he is one of the most wealthy individuals in the world, and despite of that, I think he has somewhat more than 15 hours of work a week. And so you can question what the hell is he doing. He certainly didn't make that decision. I don't know whether I would work less if I had the income of Elon Musk. I probably would. But so I don't know. Work being optional, yeah, sure, to some extent it will be. It's already optional. A lot of people could work less than they do, a lot less than they do, but they're simply not willing to accept the lower level of consumption they would have to accept. And we're not talking about starvation here. We're talking about some of the 5% most wealthy people in the world. All of them, a lot number of them has 40, 50 hours of work a week. They could easily afford working less even without having any significant negative impact on their consumption. But despite of that, they work a lot. That's the real paradox, is that why do we decide to work as much as we do? That's just a choice. And but that being said, I tend to not listen to Elon Musk and most things. I think he's obviously a very successful businessman and good for him, but an economist he will never be.
Yep, I agree with you on that. Okay, all right. Thanks, Lars. And just to wrap things up, how can people find out more about you, more about your work, what you're doing?
There is a couple of options here. One is, of course, to go to my blog, marketmonetarist.com. I can be found on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. And then my AI advisory is at Pace, PAICE.io. And you can also find my emails on those places. Yeah, I should be pretty easy to track down if you want to do business with me. Or read what I say.
Perfect. I'll leave all the links below. But really, thanks for a great discussion. I think the audience are going to get a lot from your viewpoints. So thank you very much for joining me. Hope to do it again sometime.
It has been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you.